when 8-year-old Luna Rosa Martinez burst into Judge Benjamin Crawford's courtroom with blood on her dress and desperation in her voice. She shattered his world with 5 words. "They're beating Mama because she's Comanche." In 1859, Fort Stockton, Texas, where Indian blood meant you had no rights and judges who defended the innocent often found themselves with targets on their backs, Crawford faced an impossible choice that would either restore his faith in justice or destroy everything he had left to lose. But would an old man's conscience prove stronger than a town's hatred? "Get away from that. Well, you dirty savage." The angry shout echoed across the dusty town square of Fort Stockton, Texas, on this crisp morning in 1859. Judge Benjamin Crawford nearly dropped his coffee cup as he watched a large man in a black hat shove a woman away from the community water well. The woman stumbled but caught herself with grace, her long, dark hair catching the autumn sunlight. Crawford had been sitting on the courthouse steps for 30 minutes, watching the sun climb over the wooden buildings that made up their small frontier town. At 62 years old, his bones creaked like old floorboards every morning, and his gray beard showed the stains of too many lonely meals eaten in silence. The leather Bible beside him stayed closed. He'd given up asking God for answers that never seemed to come. "Mrs. Martinez ain't done nothing wrong, Mr. Murphy," called out Mrs. Walsh from across the square. The banker's wife stood in the doorway of the general store, her arms crossed and her face stern. "She's got just as much right to that water as anybody else." Murphy turned toward Mrs. Walsh with a sneer that made Crawford's stomach turn. "Rights?" Murphy laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Indians got no rights in Texas, ma'am. Especially not half-breed squaws who think they can live among decent folks." The woman at the well, Esperanza Martinez, Crawford now remembered, straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She wore a simple brown dress with patches at the elbows, but she carried herself like royalty. Her eyes, dark as a moonless night, never left Murphy's face as he took a step closer to her. "I pay my rent, same as anyone," Esperanza said quietly, her voice steady despite the dangerous situation. "My daughter and I bother no one." "Your daughter's the problem," Murphy snarled. "Little savage been hanging around the school, putting ideas in decent children's heads, teaching them heathen songs and filling their minds with Indian nonsense." Crawford felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen Luna Rosa Martinez around town, a bright-eyed little girl who couldn't be more than 8 years old. She had a quick smile and helped her mother carry heavy baskets of laundry between houses. The idea that anyone could see threat in such a small child made his chest burn with anger. But anger and action were different things, and Crawford had learned over the years that sometimes keeping quiet kept the peace. Still, something about the way Murphy's 2 friends had started moving closer to Esperanza made the judge's hand drift toward the gun at his belt, a weapon he hadn't drawn in over 5 years. The morning wind picked up, carrying the smell of horses and hay from the livery stable. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed, and the normal sounds of a waking town continued around this tense moment. Mrs. Walsh still stood in her doorway, but Crawford noticed she'd moved her hand to rest on something behind the doorframe. Other townspeople had begun to gather, their faces showing everything from curiosity to concern to ugly excitement. "Mama always says we should treat all God's children with kindness," came a small voice from behind Murphy. Everyone turned to see Luna Rosa Martinez walking up the dusty street, carrying a wooden bucket that looked almost as big as she was. Her dark hair hung in 2 neat braids down her back, and her brown eyes held the kind of innocence that could break a grown man's heart. She couldn't have understood the danger crackling in the air around her mother. "There's the little savage now, Fletcher," one of Murphy's friends said with a cruel grin. "Come to help Mama steal more water?" Luna Rosa tilted her head to one side, confused. "Steal? But water belongs to everyone, doesn't it? Like the sky and the wind?" Crawford found himself leaning forward despite trying to stay out of the situation. Something about the girl's simple question cut through all the hatred and fear like a knife through butter. In her 8-year-old wisdom, she'd pointed out something the adults had forgotten, that some things were meant to be shared. Murphy's face turned red as a summer sunset. "Smart mouth, just like her mother. Maybe it's time someone taught both of you some manners." He raised his hand toward Luna Rosa, and Crawford felt something snap inside his chest like a dried twig. Before he realized what he was doing, the judge found himself standing up, his coffee cup rolling down the courthouse steps with a metallic clatter that seemed as loud as gunshots in the sudden quiet. That's far enough, Crawford said, his voice carrying across the square with an authority he hadn't felt in years. But as all eyes turned toward him, Crawford wondered if he'd just signed his own death warrant, and if he even cared anymore. Crawford's boots made hollow sounds on the wooden sidewalk as he walked toward the well, each step feeling heavier than the last. Luna Rosa looked up at him with those big brown eyes, and he saw something there that stopped his breath. Hope. Pure, trusting hope that the man with the judge's badge could fix whatever was wrong with her world. Judge Crawford, Murphy said, his voice trying to sound friendly but failing completely. Didn't see you there. Just having a neighborly chat with Mrs. Martinez here about proper behavior. Neighborly, Crawford repeated slowly, looking at Esperanza's split lip and the red marks on her arms where Murphy had grabbed her. That, what you call it? The crowd around them had grown bigger. Crawford could see the blacksmith, the doctor, several shop owners, and even Reverend Phillips from the Baptist church. Some faces showed support, but others looked angry that he was interfering. In a small town like Fort Stockton, taking sides meant making enemies, and enemies could make life very difficult. Now, Judge, Fletcher said, stepping closer with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, you know how things work around here. Some folks just need reminding about their place. And what place is that? Crawford asked, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was beating like a war drum. Indians belong on reservations or in the ground, Murphy answered bluntly. Not in decent towns, poisoning our children with their heathen ways. Crawford felt Luna Rosa move to stand beside him, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. Her fingers were cold from the morning air, but her grip was firm and trusting. The simple gesture hit him harder than any punch could have. Mr. Murphy, Crawford said carefully, Mrs. Martinez and her daughter are residents of this town. They pay taxes, follow our laws, and contribute to our community. Under what authority do you claim they don't belong here? Under the authority of decent white folks who built this town with their own hands, Murphy shot back. We don't need no judge who's forgotten which side he's supposed to be on. Crawford noticed several townspeople nodding in agreement, but he also saw Mrs. Walsh still watching from her doorway, and Dr. Patterson had moved closer with a concerned expression. The town was dividing right before his eyes, and his next words would determine which side had more power. Luna Rosa tugged on his sleeve. Judge Crawford, she whispered, her voice so quiet only he could hear. Is it true that judges are supposed to help people who can't help themselves? The question pierced through all of Crawford's doubts and fears like an arrow finding its target. He looked down at this brave little girl who'd run through town looking for anyone, who might care enough to help her mother. She could have hidden, could have run away, could have accepted that this was just how the world worked. Instead, she'd chosen to fight for what was right, even though she was small and scared and facing men 3 times her size. Yes, Crawford said, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's exactly what judges are supposed to do. Murphy's face twisted with rage. Then maybe Fort Stockton needs a new judge. Maybe it does, Crawford replied calmly. But until that happens, this town will follow the law. And the law says no man has the right to beat a woman for the color of her skin or the blood in her veins. The silence that followed felt like the pause before lightning strikes. Crawford could feel the weight of every person's stare, could sense the town holding its breath to see what would happen next. Some folks would support him. Some would stand against him. But most would wait to see who came out on top before choosing sides. Fletcher's hand moved toward his gun again. But this time Dr. Patterson stepped forward. That's enough, Fletcher. We've all heard enough threats for one morning. Stay out of this, Doc, Murphy warned. This ain't about medicine. Actually, it is, Dr. Patterson said firmly. Mrs. Martinez helped me save 6 lives during the cholera outbreak last spring. She knows more about healing than most doctors I've met. If you want to run valuable people out of town based on ignorance and hatred, you'll have to go through me too. Crawford felt a spark of surprise and gratitude. He'd expected to stand alone in this fight, but apparently Luna Rosa's courage was contagious. The little girl squeezed his hand tighter, and when he looked down at her, she gave him a small, encouraging smile that somehow made him feel 10 feet tall. But Murphy wasn't finished. Fine words from the judge and the doc, he said with a nasty laugh. But let's see how brave you both are when the sun goes down and decent folks decide they've had enough of Indian lovers running their town. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and Crawford knew that nightfall would bring challenges he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But looking at Luna Rosa's trusting expression, he realized that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. "We'll see," Crawford said simply, and somehow those two words carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have managed. Murphy's laughter rang out from the boarding house like a dinner bell calling vultures to feast. Crawford's boots hit the wooden sidewalk with purpose, while Luna Rosa struggled to match his long stride, her tiny legs working twice as hard to keep up. The crowd outside Murphy's place had grown from curious onlookers to an eager audience, their faces twisted with the kind of excitement that came from watching someone else's misery. "Judge, you sure about this?" asked old Pete from the barber shop, his voice carrying genuine concern mixed with fear. "Murphy's got friends, important friends, who don't take kindly to folks messing with his business." Crawford didn't slow down. The sound of leather hitting flesh drifted through the open window, followed by a woman's sharp intake of breath, not a scream, but something worse. The sound of someone refusing to break despite unbearable pain. Luna Rosa tugged at his sleeve. "That's Mama's brave sound," she whispered. "She makes it when she's scared but won't let the bad men win." The boarding house door stood slightly open, revealing glimpses of the horror inside. 3 figures moved around a fourth like wolves circling wounded prey. Murphy held a thick leather strap while 2 other men, Crawford recognized them as Fletcher and Davies from the cattle ranch, blocked any path to escape. "Please, Judge." Luna Rosa's voice trembled. "Mama taught me that brave people help when others can't help themselves. Are you a brave person?" Crawford's hand found the door handle. Through the gap, he could see Esperanza Martinez pressed against the far wall, her dark hair matted with sweat and blood, but her eyes still fierce as a cornered mountain lion. She wore the simple brown dress of a working woman, now torn at the shoulder where someone had grabbed her too roughly. "Time to find out," Crawford muttered, pushing the door wide open. The first thing that hit him was the smell, sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The second thing was Murphy's surprised face turning toward the interruption, his meaty hand still gripping the leather strap. Well, Murphy drawled, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Judge Crawford, come to watch the show?" "Come to end it," Crawford replied, stepping fully into the room with Luna Rosa close behind him. Fletcher moved to block their path, his hand resting on his gun handle. "This here's private property, Judge, and private business." Crawford's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. Esperanza stood with her back to the wall, her chin raised despite the bruises blooming across her cheek like dark flowers. Her hands were bound with rope, but her spirit remained unbroken. Scattered across the floor lay the contents of a small bag, herbs, roots, and tiny glass bottles that spoke of someone who knew the healing arts. Private business that involves assault and battery becomes public business real quick, Crawford said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Mrs. Martinez, are you hurt?" Before Esperanza could answer, Murphy stepped between them. "The half-breed don't get to speak in here, Judge. This is about theft, about protecting decent folks from Indian magic and poison." Luna Rosa darted around Crawford's legs like a prairie dog avoiding a hawk. "Mama's not a thief, she's a healer. She saved Mrs. Patterson's baby when the fever came." Davies laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Listen to the little savage defend her witch mother." Something dangerous flickered in Crawford's eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he stepped closer to Davies. "Careful with your words, son. That little girl just might be braver than the 3 of you put together." Murphy raised the leather strap again, but this time he pointed it at Crawford. "Judge, you need to leave. Now, before this gets ugly for everyone." "Too late for that," Crawford said softly. "It's been ugly for quite a while. The only question now is whether we're going to make it right." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied in distress. The storm that had been building all morning was finally ready to break, both in the sky above Fort Stockton and in the cramped boarding house room where 4 adults and 1 small girl stood on the edge of violence. Esperanza finally spoke, her voice clear despite her injuries. "Judge Crawford, I formally request protection under Texas law for myself and my daughter." The room went dead silent except for the sound of rain beginning to drum against the roof. "Protection?" Murphy's voice cracked like a whip. "From what? We're just having a conversation with a woman who's been poisoning our livestock with her Indian devil magic." Crawford felt his patience snap like a dry twig. Show me one dead animal, Murphy. Show me one piece of proof beyond your hatred. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Fletcher shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Murphy and the judge. Outside, the rain was falling harder now, turning the dust in the street to mud and washing the morning's heat from the Texas air. Luna Rosa moved closer to her mother, her small hands working at the ropes that bound Esperanza's wrists. "Mama never hurt nobody," she said, her voice small but determined. "She fixed Mr. Patterson's horse when it got the colic. She helped Mrs. Peterson when her baby wouldn't come. She even fixed the mean dog that bites everyone." "Out of the mouths of babes," Crawford muttered, watching the 8-year-old's fingers make quick work of the knots. The girl had clearly untied plenty of ropes before, probably helping her mother with laundry lines and supply bundles. Murphy's face turned red as a summer sunset. "You calling me a liar, Judge?" "I'm calling you a lot of things," Crawford replied calmly. "But let's start with wrong and see where that takes us." Davy stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his gun grip. "Judge, you're making this harder than it needs to be. The woman's half Indian. Her daughter's a quarter breed. They don't belong in a Christian town." Crawford studied Davies carefully. The man was young, maybe 25, with the kind of mean streak that came from feeling powerless in his own life. His clothes were patched and worn, his boots had holes, and his gun looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. "Tell me something, Davies," Crawford said conversationally. "When's the last time you read the good book?" "What's that got to do with anything?" "Well, seems to me the good book has quite a bit to say about welcoming strangers and protecting the innocent. But maybe they teach a different version at your church." Fletcher laughed nervously. "Judge, you're twisting things around. This ain't about religion. This is about keeping our families safe from savages." Esperanza finally freed her hands from the loosened ropes, rubbing her wrists where the rough hemp had left angry red marks. She looked at Crawford with eyes that had seen too much suffering but hadn't given up hope entirely. "My grandmother was full Comanche," she said quietly. "She taught me the healing ways before she died. I used that knowledge to help people, all people. The color of their skin never mattered to sickness or injury." "See?" Murphy pointed at her like she'd just confessed to murder. "She admits it. Indian blood runs in her veins. She's teaching that devil magic to her daughter." Crawford had heard enough. He stepped between Murphy and Esperanza, his judicial robes giving him an authority that seemed to fill the small room. "The only devil I see in this room is the one that makes grown men beat a woman for the crime of being born." The tension stretched tight as a fiddle string. Murphy's grip on the leather strap tightened until his knuckles went white. Fletcher's hand moved closer to his gun. Davies looked like he was trying to decide whether to fight or run. Luna Rosa broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of everything. "Mr. Murphy, if your mama was getting hurt, wouldn't you want someone brave to help her?" The simplicity of it, the pure, honest truth from an 8-year-old girl, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Murphy's face went through several emotions at once: surprise, anger, confusion, and something that might have been shame. That's different," he stammered. "How?" Luna Rosa asked, tilting her head like a curious bird. "How is it different?" Crawford watched Murphy struggle with an answer that wouldn't come. The big man opened his mouth several times, closed it, opened it again. His certainty was cracking like ice in spring thaw. "Because," Murphy started, then stopped. Because she's what?" Crawford pressed. "Because she's someone's daughter? Someone's mother? Because she bleeds red just like you do?" The rain outside had turned into a proper storm now, with thunder rolling across the sky like God's own bowling ball. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the faces of everyone in the room for one stark moment. Esperanza moved protectively in front of her daughter, but Luna Rosa stepped around her mother's skirts with the fearlessness that only children possess. "My mama saved your horse, Mr. Murphy," she said, looking up at the giant man with eyes that held no fear. "Remember when Thunder got snake-bit last month? Mama sat with him all night, giving him medicine and singing Comanche healing songs. She didn't ask for money. She just wanted Thunder to live." Murphy's face went pale. The leather strap trembled in his hand. Crawford seized the moment. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm placing you and your daughter under court protection. Anyone who harms you answers to me and to Texas law." "You can't do that," Fletcher protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just did," Crawford replied firmly. "And unless you want to explain to the circuit judge why you interfered with official court business, I suggest you gentlemen find somewhere else to be." The standoff continued for another heartbeat, another flash of lightning, another roll of thunder. Then Murphy dropped the strap to the floor where it landed, with a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than the storm outside. But as the three men filed out of the boarding house, Crawford caught the look that passed between them, a look that said this wasn't over, not by a long shot. How far would they go to silence a judge who dared to protect those the town had already condemned to suffer? "Judge Crawford!" Luna Rosa's scream pierced the air like breaking glass as Murphy's fist connected with her mother's cheekbone. The 8-year-old threw herself between the grown men and Esperanza. Her tiny arms spread wide like a bird protecting its nest. "Stop hurting my mama!" Murphy's face twisted with rage as he grabbed the child's shoulder. "Get this little savage out of my way!" But Luna Rosa bit down hard on his thumb, drawing blood and curses that would have made a cowboy blush. Crawford felt something snap inside his chest, not breaking, but clicking into place like a gun hammer finding its mark. He'd spent 10 years hiding behind his desk, letting other men decide what was right and wrong in Fort Stockton. Watching an 8-year-old girl show more courage than he'd mustered in a decade burned away his excuses like morning mist. "Release the child," Crawford commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years on the bench. "Now." Fletcher's hand moved toward his gun, but Crawford was already stepping forward. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Mr. Fletcher. Threatening a federal judge carries consequences that extend far beyond Fort Stockton." "Federal judge?" Murphy laughed, but his grip on Luna Rosa loosened slightly. "You're nothing but a washed-up drunk who can't even control his own courtroom." Crawford pulled his coat aside to reveal the badge he rarely wore, a silver star that caught the lamplight like a promise. "I may be many things, Mr. Murphy, but I am still the law in this county. And the law says you will release that child and step away from Mrs. Martinez." Esperanza watched this exchange with calculating eyes, her body coiled like a spring despite her injuries. She'd learned long ago that white men's promises meant little, but something in Crawford's stance suggested this moment was different. The way he positioned himself between her family and danger reminded her of warriors she'd known in her childhood, men who understood that some battles chose you. "You want to make this official?" Murphy's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Fine, but understand, Judge, once you take their side against good Christian folk, there's no going back. This town won't forget." Crawford looked down at Luna Rosa, who gazed up at him with eyes that held more trust than he deserved. Her small hand slipped into his weathered one, and he felt the weight of her faith like a sacred responsibility. In that touch, he understood something he'd forgotten during years of compromise and cowardice, that justice wasn't about winning popularity contests. "Then I suppose," Crawford said quietly, "it's time this town learned what good Christian behavior actually looks like." The first crack of thunder shook the boarding house windows, and Murphy's smile disappeared completely. Outside, the storm that had been building all morning finally broke loose. Sending sheets of rain against the glass like nature itself was washing the town clean. Fletcher drew his gun with the smooth motion of someone who'd done it many times before, but Crawford was already moving, his 62-year-old body remembering skills learned in a younger, more violent time. His shoulder caught Fletcher in the midsection, sending them both crashing into Murphy's oak table. The gun went spinning across the floor as Luna Rosa darted forward to grab her mother's hand. "Run," Esperanza whispered to her daughter, though pride flickered in her eyes at the child's bravery. "No, Mama," Luna Rosa replied with the stubborn determination that had already changed one judge's life. "We don't run anymore." Murphy reached for a whiskey bottle, raising it above Crawford's head like a club. But the bottle never fell. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, the banker's wife, stood in the doorway holding a shotgun with the confidence of a woman who defended frontier homes before. "I believe," she said calmly, "you gentlemen were leaving." The room fell silent, except for the drumming of rain on the roof. Murphy looked around at the faces surrounding him, Crawford's determined expression, Esperanza's quiet strength, Luna Rosa's unwavering courage, and Mrs. Walsh's steady aim. For the first time in his life, he found himself outgunned not by weapons but by something far more dangerous. People who refused to look away from what was right. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the boarding house like a photographer's bulb capturing history in the making. In that brilliant moment, Crawford saw his reflection in the rain-streaked window, not the broken man who'd been hiding from responsibility, but someone who'd finally remembered why he'd become a judge in the first place. "This isn't over," Murphy growled as he backed toward the door, Fletcher and his other companion following like whipped dogs. Crawford straightened his coat and picked up his hat, feeling taller than he had in years. "You're absolutely correct, Mr. Murphy. It's just beginning." As the three men retreated into the storm, Luna Rosa looked up at the judge who had chosen to stand with her family. Rain pelted the windows like applause, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced that changes were coming to Fort Stockton, whether the town was ready or not. "Are you scared, Judge Crawford?" Luna Rosa asked, her small voice cutting through the thunder. Crawford considered the question seriously, watching lightning dance across the storm-dark sky. "Terrified," he admitted, wiping blood from his split lip. "But sometimes being scared and doing what's right happen at the same time." Esperanza stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, the first time in years anyone had touched him with kindness rather than obligation. "Thank you," she said simply. But those two words carried the weight of generations who'd waited for someone to see their humanity. Thunder crashed overhead like the sound of an old world ending and a new one struggling to be born, and Crawford realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite the terror that tried to freeze your bones. 3 horses stood outside the courthouse at dawn, their riders motionless as carved statues against the gray morning sky. Crawford recognized the lead rider immediately, Chief Running Bear, whose reputation for both wisdom and warfare extended far beyond Texas borders. The sight of Comanche warriors in Fort Stockton sent whispers racing through the town like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Luna Rosa pressed her nose against the courthouse window, her breath creating small clouds on the cold glass. "Mama says those are our people. They came because word travels fast when someone stands up for Comanche blood." Crawford nodded slowly, understanding that the trial he'd planned had suddenly become something much larger than Murphy's assault charges. This was about whether Fort Stockton would stand behind its decision to protect a Native woman, even when faced with potential consequences that could affect the entire region. The courtroom filled quickly that morning, but not with the angry mob Crawford had expected. Instead, families he'd known for years took their seats with quiet determination that surprised him. Mrs. Walsh sat in the front row, her presence lending respectability to what some might call a dangerous precedent. The blacksmith brought his 2 oldest sons, their faces serious as Sunday service. Even Dr. Patterson arrived early, carrying his medical bag like a symbol of the healing this town desperately needed. "Looks like the whole community's choosing sides," observed Deputy Thomas Reed, a young man whose loyalty had always belonged more to justice than politics. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but his eyes held the alertness of someone expecting trouble. Crawford studied the crowd gathering outside through the tall windows. Murphy supporters clustered near the saloon, their faces hard as winter stone. But scattered among them were others, men and women, who seemed uncertain, their gazes moving between the courthouse and the Comanche riders, with expressions of people reconsidering beliefs they'd held since childhood. When Esperanza entered with Luna Rosa, a hush fell over the room like snow settling on prairie ground. Esperanza wore a blue dress that Mrs. Walsh had quietly provided, and her hair was braided with ribbons that Luna Rosa had chosen from the general store with careful deliberation. They looked like what they were, a mother and daughter trying to build a decent life in a place that questioned their right to exist. "Your Honor," Esperanza said as she approached the witness stand, her voice carrying the musical accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "Before we begin, I want the court to know something important. My daughter asked me this morning why we don't just pack our belongings and leave Fort Stockton forever. I told her it's because running away teaches people that fear is stronger than truth." Crawford felt the carved horse in his pocket, its smooth surface warm against his palm like a talisman of courage, passed from one generation to the next. Around the courtroom, people leaned forward in their seats, understanding that they were witnessing something historic. "Please tell the court, in your own words, what happened at Murphy's boarding house 3 days ago," Crawford said formally, though his tone held gentleness that hadn't been there in previous cases. Esperanza's testimony lasted nearly an hour, her clear voice filling every corner of the packed courtroom. She spoke of arriving in Fort Stockton 2 years earlier with Luna Rosa, seeking honest work and safety after her husband died of fever during the terrible summer of 1857. She described the gradual escalation of harassment, spoiled food left outside their boarding house room, threats whispered when she walked to the well, customers who suddenly refused her washing services once they learned about her Comanche heritage. "Mr. Murphy told me that Indian blood was like a sickness," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her dark eyes. "He claimed it contaminated everything it touched, and that decent Christian people had a duty to cleanse their community of such influences." Luna Rosa sat in the front row beside Mrs. Walsh, swinging her legs and occasionally nodding when her mother mentioned specific incidents. Her presence reminded everyone in that courtroom that this wasn't an abstract debate about race and territorial rights. It was about a family trying to survive in a world that questioned their basic humanity. The morning's testimony revealed a pattern of escalating persecution. Esperanza described how Murphy had initially seemed friendly, offering them lodging at reasonable rates. But as word of her heritage spread through town, his attitude had shifted. He'd raised their rent twice, claiming Indian families required special cleaning afterward. He'd forbidden them from eating meals with other boarders, forcing them to take food in their room like prisoners. The final incident began when Luna Rosa offered to help Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries. Esperanza continued, glancing lovingly at her daughter. Mr. Murphy saw this and became enraged. He said he wouldn't allow savage children to contaminate decent white women with their touch. Dr. Patterson's face reddened with embarrassment at this mention. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps remembering times he'd remained silent when he should have spoken up. But the morning's biggest surprise came when Chief Running Bear himself entered the courtroom, his moccasined feet silent on the wooden floor. The Comanche leader moved with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect. His traditional clothing beaded buckskins and eagle feathers, a stark contrast to the European dress of the townspeople. Through Luna Rosa, who spoke both English and Comanche with the fluidity of someone raised between two worlds, he addressed the court. "My chief says that Esperanza Martinez is known among our people as a bridge builder. She carries both our blood and your ways, trying to help both peoples understand each other better. He says that what this town decides today will be remembered by 7 generations of Comanche children yet to be born." The weight of that responsibility settled over the courtroom like heavy blankets on a cold night. Crawford realized that his decision would create ripples far beyond Fort Stockton's borders, affecting relationships between settlers and native peoples across the entire Texas frontier. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Luna Rosa looked toward the windows where storm clouds gathered like dark omens, wondering if the weather was trying to tell them something about the difficult choices that lay ahead. Guilty on all charges. Crawford's gavel fell like thunder in the packed courthouse, and Murphy's face turned the color of old leather. The crowd erupted some cheering, others shouting angry protests that shook the wooden walls. Outside, the Comanche riders still waited in perfect silence, their horses stamping restlessly in the dust. Crawford could feel their eyes on him through the courthouse windows as he announced Murphy's sentence: 6 months breaking rocks on the county road crew and a $50 fine that would go straight to the Martinez family. Fletcher got 30 days for his part in the beating, along with his silent partner who had held Esperanza's arms during the worst of it. As the men were led away in chains, Murphy turned back one final time. "You think this is over, Crawford?" His voice carried the promise of violence. "You think protecting one Indian woman makes you some kind of hero? This town's got a long memory." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Crawford banged his gavel again, but the damage was done. He could see it in the faces of the townspeople. Some nodded approval, but others wore expressions that suggested the real battle was just beginning. That night, Crawford sat in his kitchen, staring at a plate of cold beans he couldn't bring himself to eat. The autumn wind rattled his windows, carrying sounds that might have been coyotes or might have been something far more dangerous. Every shadow outside seemed to move with purpose. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Luna Rosa stood on his porch, barely visible in the moonlight, her mother's medical bag clutched in both small hands. "Judge Crawford? Mama says we need to talk to you." Her voice was different now, older somehow, weighted with knowledge no 8-year-old should carry. Crawford opened the door wider, and Esperanza stepped into the lamplight. Her face bore fresh bruises from the trial's aftermath. Someone had found her after the verdict and made their feelings known with fists. "They came to the boarding house," she explained quietly, settling into Crawford's wooden chair like she was made of breakable glass. Mrs. Walsh tried to stop them, but there were too many. They said the trial was just the beginning. Luna Rosa climbed onto Crawford's spare chair, her legs swinging freely above the floor. "Mama, tell him about the horses." "Someone cut the fence at Walker's Ranch," Esperanza continued. "Scattered his cattle across 3 counties. Now they're blaming us for it, saying Comanches always were rustlers and thieves." Crawford felt his stomach drop. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in Texas, and false accusations had a way of becoming true enough when angry men needed someone to blame. "There's more," Esperanza said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her dress pocket. "Someone left this under our door." Crawford unfolded the note, squinting to read the crude handwriting in the lamplight. "Leave by sunrise, or we'll finish what Murphy started. Next time there won't be no judge to hide behind." The kitchen fell silent, except for the wind, and Luna Rosa's quiet breathing. Crawford looked at the little girl who had saved his soul and her mother, who had shown him what real courage looked like, and felt something harden inside his chest like cooling iron. "Mrs. Martinez," he said slowly, "how would you feel about staying in my spare room tonight, just until we figure out our next move?" "Our next move?" Esperanza raised an eyebrow. Crawford smiled for the first time in days. "You didn't think I'd let you face this alone, did you?" But even as he spoke the words, Crawford could hear horses approaching in the distance, too many horses for a peaceful visit. Luna Rosa's eyes went wide as she recognized the sound, and Esperanza instinctively pulled her daughter closer. The real test was about to begin, and Crawford wasn't sure any of them would survive it. The horses arrived like thunder in the dead of night, 15 riders with torches and ropes, their faces hidden behind bandanas that couldn't mask their hunger for violence. Crawford heard them before he saw them, their hoofbeats pounding against the hard earth like war drums announcing the end of civilization. "Crawford." Murphy's voice boomed across the darkness, somehow carrying despite his supposed imprisonment. "Send out the Indian woman and her little savage, and maybe we'll let you live to see morning." Crawford peered through his kitchen window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The riders had arranged themselves in a half-circle around his house, their torches casting dancing shadows that made the night feel alive with demons. But what terrified him most wasn't the immediate threat. It was Luna Rosa's calm reaction to the danger. "They came for us before," she whispered, standing beside him at the window with the steady composure of someone far older than her 8 years. "Back in Red River County. That's why Mama moved us here." Esperanza joined them, her face set in grim determination. "There's always another town, another group of men who think Indian blood makes us less than human, but running just teaches them they can chase us anywhere." Crawford looked down at Luna Rosa, this brave little girl who had walked into his life 3 days ago and turned everything upside down. She was studying the riders with the focused attention of a general planning strategy, not crying or begging or showing any of the fear he felt coursing through his own veins. "Judge Crawford," she said quietly, "do you have another way out of this house?" The question caught him off guard. "The root cellar has a tunnel that leads to the church basement. Built it during the Apache troubles 5 years back." "Good." Luna Rosa nodded like she was checking items off a list. "Mama, you take Judge Crawford through the tunnel, get to the church and ring the bell. Mrs. Walsh said decent folks would come if they heard trouble." "What about you?" Esperanza's voice carried the sharp edge of maternal panic. Luna Rosa walked to Crawford's front door and placed her small hand on the wooden handle. "I'm going to talk to them." "Absolutely not," Crawford and Esperanza said together, but Luna Rosa had already turned to face them with eyes that held no room for argument. "They came here for us," she said simply. "If we run, they'll just follow. If we hide, they'll burn down your house and probably the whole block looking for us. But if I go out there and talk to them like the human beings they pretend to be, maybe something changes." Crawford felt his world tilt sideways. Everything in his judge's training screamed against letting an 8-year-old child walk into a mob of armed men. But everything in his heart told him that Luna Rosa Martinez had already proven herself wiser than most adults he'd known. "What would you say to them?" he asked. Luna Rosa smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd run up his courthouse steps. "The truth. That we're not going anywhere. That this is our home too. And that maybe it's time for Fort Stockton to decide what kind of town it wants to be." Outside, Murphy's voice grew more impatient. "We're losing patience, Crawford. You got 1 minute to send them out." Esperanza knelt down to face her daughter eye to eye. "My brave girl," she whispered. "Your great-grandmother would be so proud. But promise me if they don't listen. If things go bad, you run straight back here. Promise me." "I promise, Mama." Luna Rosa hugged her mother tight, then looked up at Crawford. "Judge, will you trust me one more time?" Crawford thought about all the decisions that had brought him to this moment, years of choosing the easy path, of bending to pressure, of letting fear guide his choices. Then he thought about the carved horse in his pocket, and the lesson about courage that a little girl had taught him. "I trust you," he said, and meant it completely. Luna Rosa opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, her small figure silhouetted against the torchlight. The riders fell silent, clearly not expecting to see a child emerge from the house they'd come to burn. "Good evening, gentlemen," Luna Rosa called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "My name is Luna Rosa Martinez, and I believe you wanted to speak with me." What happened next would be talked about in Fort Stockton for generations. The little girl who faced down 15 armed men with nothing but words and courage became legend that very night. Some said she spoke with the wisdom of ancient spirits. Others claimed her voice carried magic that turned hate into shame. But Crawford, watching from his doorway, knew the truth was simpler and more powerful than any legend. Luna Rosa Martinez had looked evil in the eye and refused to blink first. In doing so, she had saved not just her family, but the soul of an entire town. By morning, the riders were gone, the torches extinguished, and Fort Stockton had learned what real strength looked like. It wore the face of an 8-year-old girl who had dared to demand justice, and it lived in the heart of every person brave enough to stand with her. The carved horse still rested in Crawford's pocket, but he no longer needed it to find his courage. Luna Rosa had taught him that sometimes the smallest voices carried the greatest power, and that justice, real justice, began with one person willing to say, "This ends here." Years later, when Crawford was too old to serve as judge, people would still tell the story of the night when a little girl saved a town simply by refusing to be afraid. And they would remember that courage, like justice, was not about size or strength or power. It was about standing up when it mattered most, no matter how small you were or how big the danger seemed. In the end, Fort Stockton learned to be proud of its brave little girl and the judge who had the wisdom to trust her. And Crawford learned that sometimes the most important verdicts were delivered not with gavels, but with open hearts willing to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of the color of their blood or the stories told about their ancestors.